introduction, what are the main ideas that I'm going to discuss? The idea of power, knowledge, and discourse. So, what do we understand by the Foucauldian notion of power? Now, it is not any notion of power. The Marxist notion of power and ideology is different, as we'll see from the Foucauldian notion of power. What does he mean by knowledge? And what are the processes of knowledge creation that he talks about? What is discourse? His important works, I'm not going to recite a list for you. I think you can just get it from anywhere, but these are certain important works. Biographer in an important one, and I have referred to him a lot, so it is Eribon. Now let us come to the things that are important, key characteristics of his writing. So there is, what are the key characteristics of his writing? So let us think on it for a while. What There are things that we think of as common sense. There are remarks as common sense. We have all listened to these remarks that common sense is really uncommon. But then, what is common sense? And is common sense always true? Is common sense always correct? So when we talk about common sense, we see that Foucault critiques this very idea of common sense. He takes something which we think to be common, and then which is a common practice, and he challenges it. I can give you certain examples. For example, there in his work Madness in Civilization, how do we see madness? We see madness as something that exists, and then these people who are not sane are put into various institutions, are put into asylum, so that they cannot harm themselves or they cannot harm us. But in Madness in Civilization, Foucault shows that how this very notion of madness is actually creation of reason, or helps in the creation of reason or civilization. Foucault talks of three ways in which we can define a subject, in which a subject is defined. So the first way is the first method of defining a subject is through differentiation, through dividing. So when you divide, now when you create this division between madness, the other is the civilization, the reason. So madness is not something which is there, and for Foucault, madness is not something which is there, and um, uh, again, the asylum is not something which contains the madness is something which is created to define reason, and by extension define civilization. So I told you there's a lot of difficulty in locating Foucault, because Foucault himself believed that books are not defined by writers, books are not defined by authors. And this is again a very post-structuralist stance, where Barthes also talks about the death of the author. So he says that it is like a toolbox which you can use according to your wishes. Now, because we are studying literature, and it is very important for us to understand what Foucault thinks or conceives of as the author. Obviously, he has an anti-humanist stand. I told you he belongs to the group called the Tel Quel group, and there was this binding force amongst the members of this group, was that they all had this anti-humanist stance. Now, they could differ in many ways, but this was something that united them. What is humanism, to begin with? Because I'm repeatedly uttering this anti-humanist stance, this phrase. So what is humanism? Humanism comes after Enlightenment, and humanism places the individual. It is something that happens in the 18th, 19th century. It places the individual at the center of the universe. It makes the individual important. It makes the writer important. So Barth, in The Death of the Author, tells us how in the ancient times we had shamans What were shamans? Shamans were poets who would sing or utter, but they were not the authors. They did not have, though they went around singing. For example, we can take the example of katha in Indian scenario. So people would sing around, people will perform, the or we can take example of tribes. So they would sing things, but that they would never claim that this is written by me. With humanism came this idea of the individual, and the individual became important. The work became a projection of his experiences, a projection of his creativity. So it became the writer's work, and we started reading the work with the father's signature. This is something that Barth says. Father's signature is with the mark of the author, always remembering the author. Now, Foucault and others who take an anti-humanist stance, they say that no, the writer is not, the author is not the God. The entire idea of author God is incorrect. Foucault does away with this idea. He says that text is a web of meaning. So text is not created by me, because even when I am writing, there'll be hundred of experiences, and every word that I write would again uh, give another web of meaning. So then there's no final meaning, or there's no final experience. Suppose I write about my journey here in Jharkhand, and someone reading, another girl reading it somewhere in Manipur, might uh, now might find in it the echoes of her experiences in Manipur. So you cannot read a work with the writer's signature. He says he does a Barthes actually does away with the author. He says that as soon as the author starts writing, he brings death onto himself. He dies there. Now, Foucault doesn't say that the author is dead, because Barthes is often repeated. But in this essay, What is an Author? Foucault says that the author is not dead, but it is not a person also. It's a function. How? Let me explain. For example, if I'm reading a play by Shakespeare, if I'm reading Hamlet, I do not think once of the lady, uh, the lady that he had a licentious relationship with, or perhaps about the man whom he refers to as the summer's day. I don't think that. I don't think of him. I don't think of Shakespeare as those functions. What I think of him is as a dramatist. Is as a dramatist who is not abiding by, who is abiding by certain set of rules and not abiding by certain set of rules. So it's not the author as a person, but author as the function. Now, this is a very important concept in Foucault: author as a function, or the author function. So what is author function? Author function is something which helps us make sense of the work. For example, if I have to club few works by, say, James Coetzee, so I would have certain ideas, like I would be looking forward to certain things. I wouldn't be surprised. So author function is something which you apply. It is, again, it is not the man, it is not the author, it's not the man. It is actually your projection, the projection of you trying to understand, trying to make sense of the text. So for Foucault, the author is not dead, but he's not a man, he's not a person who created the text. He's not the person whose experiences are written down in the text. He is a function who helps us understand or make sense or see the continuities between the various texts that he has written. I hope this makes sense. So these are few quotations. You can have a look, and I'll be sharing the complete presentation. This is an incomplete one. I'll be sharing the complete presentation on the Facebook page. Now let us. So just before I move forward, let me remind you again: the author in Foucault is not dead, but he exists only as a function, not as a person. Now, Foucault and his life. So again, there's not much that we should associate we should not associate or extensively associate Foucault, his life and his work, but knowing something would perhaps make the ideas that Foucault had easy for us. Now, obviously, he was a man who had a very anti-authoritarian, having a very anti-authoritarian tendencies. He showed it from a very young age. Even as a professor, he would take part. Even as a professor, he would take part in the revolts, in the protests that would take place in his college, College de France, and earlier and other colleges that he was a part of. He also went to Tunisia, for that matter. So these these anti authoritarian tendencies are also seen in his work. Now, I'll give you a simple example. Let me. So I think you all have heard about discipline and punish, right? So discipline and punish. In discipline and punish, he talks about the prisoners, and there is something that is from his personal experience that comes into play. So he was a part of this group, which was a group, an eclectic mix of people, revolutionaries, and also the family members of people belonging to these belong incarcerated in these prisons. So they made a group, and they tried to voice the concerns. They tried to voice the concerns of those in these prisons. Now, from this experience, uh, he actually produced two texts. One is Discipline and Punish, and the other is I Pierre Revere. So I Pierre Revere is an important text, is an interesting text. I don't know how important it is, but it's an interesting text because it is an account of a man, of the confessions of the man who has murdered his mother, uh, his sister, and his brother. So the entire text is actually I Pierre Revere, the man who murdered his mother, his sister, and his brother. So that is the entire name. But more importantly, it is about his confessions. And so this again comes from this experience of his in this group, where he tried to understand the conditions of a person who is in a prison. Now, this group was not only of intellectuals. We should be reminded of this, because this group consisted of people who were incarcerated at one point, who were imprisoned at one point, or even there were questionnaires given to the family members of these prisoners. Now, Discipline and Punish, it begins uh, with a very interesting passage. It is set in 1757, if I remember correctly, and it talks about torture. So it begins with torture, public torture, and how public torture took place. So the idea here in Discipline Punish, he tries to contrast between public torture, draws a contrast between public torture and modern ways of punishment. So what are the modern, first of all, let us talk about how he begins. He begins by describing a man who's stripped out of his clothes. He's carrying a torch, and he's being taken to a place to be punished in front of a large crowd. So this, at that point, would act as a deterrent. Why did public tortures or public uh, shaming take place? The reason was that was the way how the sovereign would punish, and thereby punish one that is the person who has done the crime, and discipline the others, discipline the ones who are viewing the torture. So that is the idea in case of a public torture. So when you see someone being burnt alive, or when you're seeing someone being torn to pieces, then you kind of discipline yourself. There's a self disciplining that you don't want to be that person. Now he talks also of the modern ways. Now the modern ways is not a public, obviously it's not a public torture, and it's not even those physical means of torture. Even in America, he discusses that how it changed from torture, and now in America you are just injected by a lethal injection, and that is the capital punishment. Now in this case, but is this a progression? He says that we should not, obviously there's a contrast, but there's no progression. There's no progression. Why? He says that initially what deterred us from doing things, or what deterred us from breaking the law or standing against the law, was the sovereign was seeing or viewing. Now it is the certainty of getting punished. How? There comes the idea of panopticon. Panopticon was is described by Jeremy Bentham. He's an 18th century philosopher. It's an architectural, at that point he described it as an architectural setup where uh, all the innates, or all the subjects could be viewed by the observer, but the observer remains latent, or observer remains uh, unknown to those being observed. And from there comes the idea of the entire idea of gaze, which is very important in post colonial studies and orientalist studies. So the idea of gaze, you being looked at but you don't know who is looking at you. So with the idea of panopticon, you know that at any point you try to break the law, you try to stand against the law, what would happen is there would be a certainty of punishment. So it is nowhere from being punished to not being punished, or being tortured to be to better forms of imprisonment. No, it's again, it's different forms. It's not a progression. We are not going ahead. We are not going to a better or beautiful move. We have not moved towards a better future. It's one type of punishment, public torture, being being replaced by another type of punishment, that is perhaps e-tagging, electronic tagging, where you'll be if you have done something wrong, you'll be recognized forever, you will be put on a list, and you will be traced, all your activities would be traced. In fact, with the pandemic, it has increased more. uh, so with the idea of punishment, the idea of punishment has the idea of discipline imbued in it. It is there intrinsically. When you talk of punishment, punishment is done for disciplinary, is done to discipline, right? So when we talk about panopticon, we know, now we know that we are being watched. We don't even know that who is watching us, but we know that we are being watched, and because we know that we are being watched, we behave in different way. uh, there's something about power. Power doesn't exist like power. We'll come to discussion of power. Foucault doesn't see power as something which is a noun. He sees it as a verb. I'll tell you why. So power for him is a performance. Power for Foucault is a performance. So power as a he talks about it in Knowledge and Power, and where he says that power is not something which can be possessed. It is not a noun. What is power then? Power is a verb. So we perform power. How? Uh, the thing is that, for example, if I am talking to my senior, I'll perform the linguistic structures of power. I will be talking in a certain way. When I'll so perhaps my interaction with you would be different than my interaction with my senior, or perhaps my interaction with my friend. So power comes into play. It's not power as a capital P. I've just written it in the title, but Foucault says that I'm not concerned with the power with the capital P. It doesn't exist. Power with a capital P doesn't exist. What exists is power relations. Okay, I'll in fact correct this. What exists is power relations. And how do power relations exist? They exist when we come into contact with, and when there is an encounter between two people, two forces. Okay, so power is not something absolute. Usually the Marxist tendency, now he differs from the Marxist tendency uh, of seeing power as something which is repressive, power which is in the hand of the oppressor, which is always in the hand of the state, and then the state is oppressing. I'll give you certain examples. For example, if you uh, if you consider the entire idea of the entire notion of ideology in the Marxist way. So what is ideology? Ideology is something which the powerless is fed with, and it is made or it is constructed by the powerful always. So it's always the powerful oppressing, and the powerless is there, who is perhaps an inactive subject. In Foucault this doesn't happen. Foucault says that there is no supreme power, or power is not repressive. There are power relations. So there will be one kind of power relation between me and my, perhaps me and my mother, me and my sister. So that would function. So power is dispersed in Foucault. Power is not centralized. Power is dispersed in Foucault. And power is not repressive, because when you say that power is repressive, you are actually rendering the resisting identities, you are leaving the resisting identities as powerless. So it is like the state has power, so we become powerless, we have no power. It's not like that. For Foucault, it is a relation where I also exercise certain amount of power, the state also exercises a certain amount of power, and for him it is not always the state, it is not very centered to the state. He was a student of Althusser, and he takes the idea of power relations from Althusser, but he also differs in uh, de-anchoring or unanchoring the relations of power uh, being uh, being put to the state or being ascribed to the state. It is not all, when we talk about power relations, it is not always about the subject and the state. Okay, not the citizen subject. It could mean a relationship between a man and a woman in a household. It could mean a power relation between a son and a father. It could mean a power relation between the manager and the work and the perhaps the employer and the employee. So it could mean many things. It could even mean power relations, intra-government and para-government power relations. So there's not only one form of, like, state is not the only center, or state is not where the centrality of the power is fixed. Power lies in everyone. Power is dispersed. So power is not repressive in Foucault. It's a web of relations. I told you it is dispersed, and it's a web of relations. He sees it as something productive. Because now it is his idea. He says that whenever there is an exercise of power, there are strategies that are, now this difference between power as possession and power as strategies. So I'll give you a quick example. If we see as women, if we see for example, if we see the tribal identities as continually and always wounded identities, always already wounded identities, then we forget to see the instances of resistance. We forget to see the instances where they have employed strategies to be more powerful. I'll give you one example for Santhal Pargana. The entire uh, so what happened, British, yeah, so the during the British regime, the British, it's, we usually see it as a series of oppression or a series of victories of the British over the Indians. But in the Santhal uprising, it was actually the Santhals got their due. They got that land, and that entire Santhal Pargana was formed. So actually, British lost uh, to the indigenous forces. So you need to see power as not as a possession, not, it is Foucault, it is again a Foucauldian notion. You don't see power as a verb, sorry, you don't see power as a noun, you don't see power as a possession, you see power as a strategy. Now remember this: power as a strategy, power as a power as a verb, power as something, power relations as something which we perform rather than something which is given. Now like if you move further, so I think the idea of panopticon is oft repeated, the idea of uh, power, again power and discourse. But I think discourse, knowledge and power are three ideas which are more important when we discuss Foucault. So with, now with power, so with power is always, we have this question of resistance. And Foucault says this, I'm repeating this, Foucault says, where there is power, there is resistance. So resistance is something which is there in power. Now, how correct it, many critiques feel that this is incorrect, or this is not justified to, not a justified statement, but Foucault says it, where there is power, there is resistance. So resistance is something that doesn't, resistance is something not that doesn't exist in binary opposition, or doesn't exist as opposing power. It is something which exists in power, which is something which exists with power. So you need to understand there is this power and resistance. We are usually taught to see them as two binary opposites. For Foucault, they are not binary opposites. Power contains resistance in it. So wherever there'll be power, there'll be resistance. And he says that for power, you can never capture power. There is always this fight. There is always this game for power. That you'll always be fighting for power. You will be always applying strategies for power, but you'll not never conquest power. So there is no dominance, so to say. And he gives a very everyday example of that. He talks of a discussion, again, when an employee talks to the employer, he will talk in certain ways because there he's performing power. But the moment he moves out of that place and he's with his colleagues, he will be calling that very employer different names, and perhaps even taking out his frustration, calling him names and saying things about him. The On the other hand, the boss, the employer, would go to his colleague and talk of how difficult it is to maintain that power position, or perform that power relation, because you always have to be good, you always have to be precise, you always have to be certain things. So power relations are not something which is a given, it's a performance. Now let us move forward and see Foucault's idea of revolution. So because we are talking about resistance, so what about revolution? Foucault doesn't believe in the idea of revolution, so to say. He doesn't believe in his problem with the Marxist principle is actually this, that uh, doesn't he doesn't abide by that notion that there is a utopian vision, or there is a utopian future, so to say. He doesn't believe that there's a utopian future. He believes, now how does Marxism work, or how does any revolution for that matter works? They usually have this mapping out of they map out a utopian future. So there is for example, there was aristocracy, and they felt that aristocracy was not good, so they move towards they fight for notions like fraternity, equality, uh, fraternity, equality, and sorry, I'm just They talk about certain ideals and certain notions, right? So as we move further, do we find those notions? No. There's the French Revolution, and then there's the first reign of terror, the Jacobins, that kind of escalates, and then you also have the third reign of terror, so that kind of continues. There, this is where Foucault talks about the event of the event of freedom and the practice of freedom. What is the difference? He says revolutions can bring about events of freedom. So what are these events of freedom? What would happen? There will be changes. For example, 1990s, you have the abolition of the abolitionists win, and apartheid is removed from South Africa. But do the power structures change? That is the question. Do the power structures change? So event of freedom, what it does, it just reverses the role. Even in the French Revolution, what happens is the role is reversed. There are new subjects, but the structure remains the same. The oppression remains the same. Before French Revolutions also, there was mass killing, there was manhunting, there were disciplinary acts, there were punishments, and uh, again, the citizens were not, even in the democracy, even after the revolution, do you see that the citizens get what they want? Again, you have the reign of terror, you have the Jacobins. It is there into A Tale of Two Cities, that how the power structures change, uh, how the power relations change, but the power structures do not change. There is always the oppressor and the oppressed, and all these activities continue. For example, we got freedom, and still to till date do we keep on asking, are we free? Are we free? Why is that? Because when we say are we free, we are not talking about one sovereign being replaced by another sovereign, uh, perhaps disguised as something more genial, something more friendly. We are here talking of changing the power structures. You have many examples of it. J.M. Coetzee's Disgrace talks of it, where it is a post-apartheid society, but then again you find that the tortures and everything remains same. Uh, David Lurie, he is the character there, and he says that he would not confess, or he would not say that he's sorry, because he isn't, for molesting a student of his. So the entire story of disgrace tells us that though the governments have changed, though there has been a revolution, but then the very structures of power has the very structures of power have not changed. So the event of freedom is totally different from the practice of freedom. So where do we have this practice of freedom? The practice of freedom can be seen uh, in I think you can see it in Nelson Mandela. You can have different individual examples, and there's no now he doesn't believe in a universal ruler or a universal leader, right? He believes in local interventions. He believes in local resistances, and there comes the idea of, now this is one important idea that he talks of, and which is of interest, is specific intellectual. So who is a specific intellectual? He says it's not possible, or perhaps he doesn't see uh, revolutionary change coming from intellectuals who would lead masses, or who would lead the entire nation to something. He says that is not a kind of revolution he's talking of. When he talks of progressive, again, a term that he gives, progressive revolution, it is not a leader who will take the entire class, entire world, or the entire uh, mass of people to freedom. No. Specific, he talks of specific intellectuals. What does it mean? It means that your resistance, your power relations need to be studied or need to be read as something which is very local. He gives example of Dr. Edith Rose, where he says, as an example of specific, intellectual. So she was working in these prisons in France, and when the conditions really improved, when the conditions were really bad, she participated in the she participated in the protests. Now what happens? She, belonging to the system, when she sits and protests, that gives weight to the protest. Now he also gives other examples. He gives example of a nuclear scientist. Suppose a nuclear scientist, if he says that no, you should not use nuclear, suppose a head of a nuclear project, he says that you should not use nuclear arms, nuclear power should not be harnessed as nuclear arms, but perhaps something fruitful as nuclear energy. So his words, his words, or his being there in that resistance would create more change. So that is the idea of the specific intellectual, and the idea of progressive reformation, the idea of progressive revolution, where the revolution is not about the general, the universal, the masses. It is more local. When you read, the resistance of the Santalas, when you read the resistance of the Paikas, when you read the resistance, this resistance in very small acts, again, resistance in very small activities in the household between a husband and the wife. So that kind of revolution is what he talks about. Okay, so I think I would like to check the chats if you have certain questions, and then we can move ahead. Okay, so I think we can move ahead. I don't find any questions yet. You can feel free to ask questions, please. Uh, Questions are invited. Okay, so let us move forward and talk about the idea of discourse. So we have already discussed power and progressive politics, we have discussed specific intellectuals, we have discussed the author and the author function. We have discussed many things till now, but I don't see any questions. I was expecting questions. Ma'am, okay, there are questions. So let me first take these questions and then we can proceed, because the other section is about knowledge and discourse. Ma'am, is power something individual according to Foucault? It differs from person to. I can see it's not individual, because again, I told you that power is all about, this is Devika, right? Power cannot be something individual because it is all about encounters. It has to at least have two people, right? Because it is an encounter. I told you there has to be a boss and there has to be an employee, and then there will be the performance of power. So power is never individual. Power is always performed when there is an encounter. Now, this encounter should not be just seen as the encounter between a government which is all powerful, a state which is all powerful, and the citizen subject who is powerless. It is actually a dispersal of power where there are many relations. So there are power relations between me and my father. There are power relations between me and my cousin. There are power relations between me and my colleagues. There is a power relation between me and my seniors. And now there is not single relation, it is relations. There are strategies. So at times, perhaps I would resist. Okay. So again, even between the two, first, it requires at least two. It requires an encounter. So it can never be individual. Second, even between two people, it is not always similar or always uniform. It is different strategies that we keep involving and keep. Suppose I at times I would listen to my boss, and at times perhaps I want to show my resentment. Then I would not work for extra hours, or I would do something to show that I resent this. So there I apply strategies of power. So I also have a certain power. So I also, uh, again, it's not about possessing, but I also have a certain power relation. So there's a power dynamics. It's not that someone is oppressing me and I'm being oppressed. Okay. Ma'am, okay, ma'am, does discourse determine these power relations? Then what determines these discourses? I was coming to that question. Okay, Anupam Devnath, thank you for the question. Actually, when we talk about discourse, so how does Foucault describe discourse? He says that it can be a statement which makes, which has meaning. It can also be a set of a set of statements which are connected. For example, a discourse on racism, a discourse on feminism, or it could be something which is there because of a practice. Now, for example, there is okay, so for example, we all write essays, and when we write essays, there is a certain format that we follow. But there is nothing that was written at any point that tells us that essays should be written in this way or a debate should be conducted in this way. But it has been there, and it has been there because of a practice. So he sees discourse in these lines. Now, uh, because your question is, yes, actually it is both ways. uh, it's a very interesting statement that he makes. There is Foucault makes, he says that there is no, again, please listen to this, there is no power can exist without knowledge. No power can exist without creating knowledge. So you have to create knowledge to assert power, and knowledge when created creates power. So it is a circle. It is uh, they are interdependent. You cannot say that discourse determines power relation, or relation determines uh, or power relations determines discourse. It is actually a symbiotic relation where both of them are kind of helping each other. I can give you one example that actually Orientalism, which is an essay by Said, borrows a lot from Foucault. And there he gives the example of how. So the British came here, like I'm giving this example of colonialism. So they had a certain kind of scientific knowledge that developed in industrialization, a scientific knowledge that developed in Britain in the 17th century, in the 16th, 17th century. What happened after that was, by creation of that knowledge, the Europeans or the British get the power to colonize. Now, to colonialize these countries that they did. Now, because of knowledge, they got power. Now, because they had power, they could also create knowledge. They could create this entire picture of the Oriental as exotic, as something which is very divine or spiritual, as in opposition to something which is very scientific and European, or the Occidental. So again, you see that, and this knowledge, this creation between the Oriental and the Occidental, and the Oriental as certain issue, certain as the other, and the Oriental as certain qualities, again gives the British power to rule over us. Because they're even when they left, we still have it in the structures that are left, that are there in our mind. So this is how it works. It is actually, power and knowledge are interdependent. There is an interdependence. You don't say that one determines the other, or the other determines the first one. It is both determine each other. So where there is knowledge creation, there would be power. And whenever there is power, there will be creation of knowledge, because creation of knowledge sustains power, and power sustains creation of knowledge. Any other questions? Can you repeat specific individual? Sorry, can you repeat the question? Okay, ma'am, can we look at Foucault's statement about power and resistance paving way for the concept of dominant, residual, and emergent? See, Foucault actually, post Foucault, I think there are many theorists who have taken up Foucault and ideas from Foucault. I told you the entire idea of the entire essay, Orientalism, or gender trouble for that matter, borrows a lot from Foucault. The idea of gender as a performance, or gender as a verb and not as a noun, is something which is taken from Foucault, which says that power is a verb and not a noun. So you see that there is a borrowing, there is certainly a borrowing, but as because you talk about the concept of dominant, Foucault says that there is actually power uh, fails in that sense, because power can never give you a complete dominance. There will always be, I told you, there is resistance inside, like there is resistance uh, intrinsic in there's resistance imbued in power, there is resistance which is intrinsic to power. So you don't have dominance for that matter. The person who is in fact uh, in a certain power political relation, or in a certain power relation, even if a person is more powerful for some time, or if the person is more powerful, you cannot consider them to be dominant and the other to be passive. I'll give you the example of the husband and wife, for example. So the man is always the man is seen as the universal, as for by few of the feminists, and the man as the universal, the notion of the man as the universal. But you have to also consider that the practices of patriarchy has to be repeated again and again and again. If things like domestic violence take place again and again, it's reiterated. Why? If practices like uh, rape rape or molestation, or these practices are reiterated, you have to think why. Because this idea of the man as the universal, this is not something which is actually untouched, which remains untouched, or which will be there forever. So it's not, it's again, there is no dominance. There's always a sense of resistance, there'll always be resistance, and even one who is more powerful will in a power relation, the one who is more powerful will always have this insecurity of losing power, and therefore there will always be the repetition of uh, certain forms that reinstate these powers, uh, reinstate the power. Okay, now does center of power change according to Foucault in relationship of power? See, again, there is no, in Foucault, I'm repeating the question, this is Pallavi Pandey. Does the center of power always change according to Foucault in relationship of the power and powerless? In Foucault, there is no powerful and the powerless. In Foucault, it's a relation where you always have some sort of power. Even the resisting identity, even the one who is less powerful has power. So in Foucault, there is no powerless. You need to, that is first thing that you need to understand. Does the center of power change? Now there is no center of power, so that matter. There can be a person who has more power for some time, and the other would be lacking in that power. And yes, in that relation, in that particular relation, now you have to investigate the relation. You cannot say it in a general term. So can the woman be more powerful than the man? uh, Again, you'll have to go to individual encounters. In certain, I'll give you an example, which is very, I think, which you would be familiar to. In certain households, the grandmother, the figure of the grandmother, she's a woman, right? But after the death of the grandfather, or after the death of the male partner, what happens is that grandmother takes the position of power. Okay, and she becomes the one who has a lot of power and who exercises a lot of power. And in that, and then there is this relation where the other woman, perhaps daughter-in-law, becomes less powerful. So obviously at one point in one relation, which once existed as a wife, this grandmother was less powerful. But in another relation where there is the daughter-in-law, where it's this relationship between her and the daughter-in-law, this entire status quo changes. She becomes like more powerful, and this woman has to perhaps find strategies to get more power or to work her way around. So uh, there is you just need to understand, in Foucault there's no powerless. I'm repeating this again and again. Okay, could you please repeat the first three slides? That would not be possible for me, but yeah, I'll do this again. I'm repeating it. I'll share all the slides, that to the completed ones, uh, on the on our Facebook page, Ashutosh, and also on our YouTube channel. We will be posting this video, and you can also re-watch it again. And if you have missed certain parts, or you have certain questions, you can come up with them. uh, Now there's a lot when it comes to Foucault, and there's this entire idea of the subject, and how the subject is created. He says that there are three ways in which a subject is created. I mentioned one, that is, the subject is created by difference. You so you How does this work? So by differentiating, by dividing, how do you divide? You divide between the mad and the madness and reason. So madness in civilization is about that. The heterosexual and the homosexual, or the queer. So that is how you divide. And then that is how a subject is made, a subject to law. And if you go into detail, the entire idea of subject is very uh, complicated in that way. So perhaps we'll do a session on the idea of subject and how it has developed and how different theorists see it. But for Foucault, there are three ways. One is by dividing. The other way is by scientific knowledge or scientific discourse. That is, suppose if you have a scientific discourse on linguistics, so then anyone who speaks or uses language is the subject of linguistic discourse. And then if you talk about law, so if you talk about labor, so anyone who labors becomes the subject of economics. Anyone who talks becomes the subject of linguistics. Again, anyone who perhaps you can find other ways, right? Anyone who performs would become a subject of something. And then the third way is which he talks about, and perhaps we will have to take another session where I'll do the close reading of these three texts, uh, which I have mentioned in the poster. The last one was about the practice of self care, and how it can be seen as a practice, as moving towards freedom, as a practice of freedom, the care for self as a practice of freedom. It's an interview. So the third way he talks about is subjectification, where the self works upon the self, and self decide, like I work upon myself and I decide what to do. Now these three do not work separately. You are subject of all these things. Because I'm speaking, I am a subject of the linguistic discourse. Because if I labor, I'm the subject of economics, right? So if I'm working on myself in certain ways, then I am the subject. That is called subjectification. So these three work simultaneously on a person. Okay, so please send the Facebook link. Okay, I can send you the link. I would mail you the link, in fact, for both the YouTube channel, to our YouTube channel, and to to our YouTube channel, and to the Facebook group. Uh, thank you. Doubts got cleared. Thank you, Ranjana. There's something. Wait, ma'am, is there any power relation between man and animals? Uh, it's a question that you have to think about. It's not that simplistic as yes and no. But I attended this conference on the human and the non-human, like the human body and the non-human body, and how the human itself tries to define uh, human tries to define itself by talking of the non-human. So there, perhaps the entire idea of animal uh, as, again, non-human, for that matter, the one who requires care, one who lacks in certain ways, there is a power relation. There is certainly a power relation. And in fact, there was this very beautiful talk. I'll attach a link to it. I remember watching it on YouTube, which talks about this entire uh, practice of keeping pet as a violence of inclusion. It could also be seen, this violence of inclusion could also be seen um, in a child and a grown-up relationship, right? There is a movie called Capernaum where the child goes and sues his parents because goes and sue his parents because they brought him to this world without his without his volition to decide, or without him being able to decide. He was brought into this world and he had to go through a lot of misery because of that. So the notion of, yes, there is obviously a power relation involved when it comes to uh, people whom we see as having no agency, or non-human forms which we consider as having no agencies. We don't know if an animal really wants to cuddle you, or we don't know if an animal wants to be there leashed all the time, or to be in your house. Perhaps he would be happier roaming about in the streets. So because they don't have that the capacity, the human uh, capacity, or the human quality of language, now again, the human quality of human language, so you consider them to be perhaps uh, powerless, or you kind of want to take care, or you want to care for them. So there is a lot of way we can think about. Actually, okay, so Kathy asks about how Foucault sees power operating in context of biopolitics. Biopolitics was one of our close readings, which I have kept for the other sessions. So I hope I can answer it then. Uh, but okay, I think I have answered other questions. And we are also, like, it's already 7. We started at 6 and we were supposed to wind this up by 7:05. Uh, Again, the close reading for biopolitics and uh, the interview, that is the care for self as a practice of freedom, we will do that in another session. Perhaps that would happen next month, because this month we already have many things lined up. We Next Friday we have Amrit. So Amrit is a junior research fellow from IFLU, and he would be taking a session on postmodernism. After that, we also have a session with uh, 5 or 6. Right now I'm talking to 5 JRFs from different central universities. They'll be taking a session, and they'll be taking your questions, and they'll be sharing their methods of preparation. So I wish that helps those who are preparing for NET, because I know that 20th was not a great day, and being informed that exams are just 25 days ahead of you is really scary. But at least we'll do whatever we can to help you out. We also have sessions on feminism, a session on feminism lined up, and a session by Dr. Gautam Karmarkar. So the topic is not yet to be decided, but as and when it happens, we'll keep you informed. So please join the Facebook page. I'll be sending you the link. And also those who have entered their I have sent out the link to the form for Amrit's session. There you also have this question whether you agree to be a part of a WhatsApp group that would be created by us or not. If you have uh, opted for yes, then we can surely, we are working to form a group where we can discuss this, and we can also share notes perhaps. So thank you all. Thanks a lot. Yes, I will also share the Facebook link on WhatsApp. If this is all, can we just uh, thank you for enlightening us. Thank you, Aman. Yeah, a WhatsApp group. I have sent the link for it. I have sent the link for registering for the sessions. In that, we have asked you your number, so we'll add you to a WhatsApp group. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everyone. I am really, uh, I'm really overwhelmed by the response. We didn't expect this in the very first session. We had to really, really not invite few people because we wanted it to be for those who really need it, genuinely require this help. So uh, I'm really thankful to you all that you joined and kept us that this will keep us motivated to come up with such sessions. And thank you, thanks a lot. So yeah, other details will be on the mail. And I think I can just wind up the meeting, and you can join us on the Facebook page and everything, and we will make sure that we at least make literature a little easier for you, because I realize that coming from a small town myself, and many of our colleagues, members from Ashutosh, are from small towns, so we realize it is grounded, this entire initiative is grounded in our experience, where we really had to work hard, and there were times when we would really find no one to look up to. But yes, there were people whom we looked, there were also people who helped us out, so that is why we can help you now. And this entire initiative, Ashutosh, is named after my professor. So he's no more, but he played a very important role in my life and in many of our lives in St. Xavier's, Rachi. And it was because of him that I could clear JRF. So it's just a way of saying thank you. And he left me before I could share my results with him. So he left on, I think, 14th, and our 14th of June, and our exams were in July. So it was really disheartening that I could not share with him that experience. But I want to at least devote this entire initiative to him, because he helped me when I needed. He helped us when we needed him, and we want to help those who need us. So never feel that you're alone, or never feel that you require those expensive expensive coaching classes to learn literature. I have come across encounters of people selling their land and paying for coaching in Delhi. So please, I just wish that we kind of help someone out, and someone doesn't have to pay such an exorbitant price for learning. So yes, I thank you all. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm ending the meeting now. Do someone has to say something? Should I unmute you? Okay, I'm unmuting you all for a while, where you can share your reviews. Please raise your hands, because it will be really noisy if you all start speaking at once. So Ashik has to say something. Ashik, yes. Ashik, you have to say something.
Yeah, hello.
Yes, Ashik.
Am I audible?
Yes.
I'm very sorry I've joined late,
Okay.
but whatever I got, it was very nice. Thank you so much for the initiative, first of all. Okay. And looking forward for more such sessions on various important topics. At present, I can only think about cultural studies, because it is literally harassing me, because there is no proper, you can say, material or proper book, means friendly or a student friendly book, which is not so much expensive to start studying about culture studies. So please make sure that we get something on culture studies.
Actually, I think you missed it, Ashik, because you joined in late. At the very beginning, I mentioned that we are planning to start a series on cultural studies, because not only the books are costly, but also because if you have access to these books, the problem is that the language itself becomes inaccessible for many people. And
Yeah, yeah.
especially when you're preparing for a competitive exam, you do not have that the time viability of going through a single book of William Raymond for 5 hours and spending 5 hours there, and then preparing
Exactly.
notes and then studying for it, especially
Exactly.
when UGC decides dates like this out of the blue and it's 25 days.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we do realize that. And so at the beginning of the lecture, before beginning this session, we don't call this lecture, we call this session, because we are no teachers or professors. We are just students like you who have the same experience, who share the same experience, and who perhaps would like to make life little easier for brothers, sisters, friends, perhaps.
Yes, yes,
So
absolutely. Yeah, I just want to add something that after cultural studies, if you can, then please add the other new entries in the syllabus of UGC NET, that is the language section, and after the research methodology, literary research methodology, whatever it is.
yes, so
Uh,
this program would now be a program that would, I hope that it would be a program where we are roping in people who would be there for a long time, and it is not just a series of 10 sessions or series of 5 sessions. It is going to be there. So if
Exactly.
just because again I told you there is an emotional quotient attached to this initiative, so obviously I'm not going to leave it in between. We are looking forward to more such designing and working around to have more such sessions for you. So
Ma'am, can I also say something?
yes, Devika.
Ma'am, ma'am, thank you so